Lightsworns are an expansion to the fan-favorite and largely successful Lightsworn archetype, releasing Code of the Duelist. Considering how beloved the Lightsworns were, it's kind of a shock that not only did this series of cards flop, but they never revisited the Lightsworn, despite the original Lightsworns getting support in the future. Today, we're going to go over the Twilightsworns and why it didn't help the original Lightsworn archetype see more play. Before we can go over the Twilightsworns, we of course have to talk about the archetype they were designed to support, the Lightsworn. The Lightsworn's main thing is that they each have an effect to make you mill a number of cards at the end phase, with just a few exceptions. Orcus, the Lightsworn Druid, has the effect where you mill 2 cards near the end phase, and Lila, Lightsworn Sorceress, has the effect where you mill 3 cards during your end phase. However, they also have other useful effects, Orcus making it so that your opponent can't target any of your Lightsworn monsters, no matter where they are. So that includes the graveyard, and funny enough, the banishment zone. And Lila allows you to switch it from attack to defense mode to lock it in that position until the end of your next turn in order to destroy a spell or trap card. They also have effects that benefit from being milled or having cards in your grave. For example, one of their most famous cards is Wolf, Lightsworn Beast, a level 4 that can't be normal summoned or set. But if it's sent from the deck to the graveyard, you special summon it. And it's also not on a hard once per turn. A lot of their spell and trap card support also wants you to mill cards or themselves like being milled. For example, Lightsworn Saber is an equipped spell that gives a Lightsworn monster 700 attack, but it also has the effect to automatically equip itself to one of your Lightsworns when it's milled. There's also their field spell, Realm of Light, which gets a shine counter every time an effect causes you to mill, and gives your Lightsworn monsters 100 attack for each shine counter on it. If it would be destroyed, you can also remove 2 counters from Realm of Light to protect it. As you can see, there's already a pretty clear game plan forming here. You have your normal Lightsworns which mill yourself, which also give you more value off of cards like Wolf, as well as filling your graveyard for various cards like Pot of Avarice. However, there's a very important card we haven't talked about yet, and that's the deck's main boss monster, Judgment Dragon. This is a level 8 dragon with 3000 attack and 2600 defense. It can't be normal summoned or set, but it can special summon itself if you have 4 or more different named Lightsworn monsters in your graveyard. It also lets you pay 1000 light points to destroy all other cards in the field, and it makes you mill 4 cards during the end phase. And none of these effects are hard once per turns, or even once per turns at all, like in the case of the ability to wipe the field. Judgment Dragon is a pretty great payoff for the deck, allowing you to push through for tons of damage out of nowhere and being pretty easy to facilitate in a deck that mills as much as this deck does. And while we're here, we do need to mention Feco, the Lightsworn Hunter, a card that was not only good in Lightsworn, but just a good generic card around the time of its printing. This is a level 2 beast flip monster with the effect where, on flip, you simultaneously destroy any one card in the field and mill 3 cards, though this card had a lot of erratas where sometimes this effect was not simultaneous. Now, there's a long and storied history of flip effect monsters that remove things when they're flipped, from the original Maneater Bug to Penguin Soldier to Snow Maneater, which technically isn't a flip monster, but it's close enough. All of these cards have been playable at some point in early Yu-Gi-Oh!, as they were one of the better forms of removal around that point. But Feco was maybe the best generic option thanks to being able to destroy any card and not just monsters. And milling cards is generally an upside, so that offered even more value. The only upside the other cards had were really just having better stats, but Feco was still considered the better option most of the time. This lineup of cards made Lightsworns a beloved archetype. So, people were pretty excited to hear that the archetype would be receiving further support in Code of the Duelist after a few rounds of initial support. The deck received 8 new cards as part of the Twilightsworn wave of support, so we can actually go over all of them pretty easily. First is the line of retrains of the deck iconic monsters, starting with the Feco Twilightsworn Fighter. This is a level 2 beast with 200 attack and 100 defense. If it's normal summoned or flip face up, you can banish 1 Lightsworn monster from your hand or graveyard, then banish 1 card on the field. It also has the effect where, on a soft once per turn, if another Lightsworn monster's effect is activated, you mill 3 cards. Here we can see the 2 themes of the Twilightsworn cards, banishing and milling when you activate the effect of a Lightsworn monster. Now, the second theme is a pretty reasonable change from the old Lightsworn cards. Code of the Duelist was released in 2017, which was the same year that Link monsters were introduced. In fact, the World Chalice cards were starting to come out around this time. The point here is that the game had sped up a lot even by this time, so waiting until the end of the turn to get your mills was actually a bit of a problem. Making it so that you could mill as soon as you activated the effects of a different Lightsworn monster definitely made getting your engine rolling sooner a lot easier. And it is worth noting that the Twilightsworn monsters are also considered Lightsworns. thanks to their naming conventions containing the word Lightsworn in it. The first change is a little bit less obvious though. The previous Lightsworn cards really don't have any synergy with banishing cards. Sure, all their mill effects mean that you'll have plenty of cards in your graveyard to banish for the Twilightsworns, but as we also said, the game had gotten fast enough at this point that waiting until your end phase to mill was kind of slow. However, we'll get to the problems with the archetype in just a second. The next card up is Lila, Twilightsworn Enchantress. This is a level 4 spellcaster with 1700 attack and 200 defense. She has the effects where, when a spell or trap card is activated, you can banish a Lightsworn monster from hand or grave to target a spell or trap card in the field and destroy it. Also, it has the Twilightsworn effect to mill 3 cards. This is fine spell and trap card removal on a monster, though it's certainly not exciting. The next monster they got is Lumina, Twilightsworn Shaman. This is a level 3 spellcaster with 1000 attack and defense. It has the Twilightsworn effect to mill 3, and you can banish a Lightsworn from your hand or grave to target and special summon a banished Lightsworn monster. This is one of the few ways that the Lightsworns have to swarm the field without relying on the Lightsworn cards, and unfortunately it doesn't work quite as well as you'd want. If you open the game by normal summoning Lumina, then you can't banish a Lightsworn from your hand and then summon it, because you won't have a banished Lightsworn monster when you try to activate the effect, so you won't have a valid target at that point. The next Twilightsworn is Jane, Twilightsworn General. This is a level 4 warrior with 1800 attack and 1200 defense. It has the Twilightsworn mill effect to mill 2, and you can banish a Lightsworn from hand or grave to target one monster from the field and make it lose attack and defense equal to the banished monster's level times 300 until the end of the turn. Jane is one of the most medium cards in the deck, something you'd mostly just play to have more copies of Lightsworn cards, more than because it has a strong effect. The ability to decrease the attack of a monster is ultimately just weaker than just banishing any card in the field, and the only upside of Jane is higher attack and defense. But at this point in the game's history, that's not much of a consultation. Then there's the warped version of Judgment Dragon, Punishment Dragon. Like JD, this is a level 8 dragon with 3000 attack and 2600 defense. It can be special summoned from your hand when you have 4 or more banished Lightsworn monsters of different names, and lets you pay 1000 life points during either player's turn to shuffle all cards in the graveyard and face up banished monster cards, except for Lightsworn monsters, into the decks, and it's on a soft once per turn. It also has the Twilightsworn mill effect for 4 cards. This is, overall, a bit of a downgrade from Judgment Dragon, at least comparing how strong they were at the time of their releases to each other. Judgment Dragon's ability to wipe the board was great in a period where time-like cards like Dark Hole and Heavy Storm were on the ban list, whereas Punishment Dragon's quick effect graveyard removal is relatively weaker in this time period. Obviously, getting rid of the graveyard is a good effect, and having it at quick effect speed can stop a ton of cards that summon themselves or other cards out. But getting rid of the entire board was, and honestly still is, slightly better. Upgrading this to banishing the board or even just Judgment Dragon's same effect at a quick effect speed would have been more than enough to make Punishment Dragon an amazing card. This downgrade in effect quality likely wouldn't have been an issue, though, if Punishment Dragon was easy to bring out. Unfortunately, its condition is a huge pain. Banishing 4 of your Lightsworn monsters just takes a ton of time to do, and with how fast the metagame was at this time, that wasn't something you were even likely to get, much less guarantee. This is a good time to talk about some of the issues with the Twilightsworn monsters, and why they failed to really integrate themselves into the Lightsworn strategy. Because the failure of integration was the biggest issue with these cards. Konami looked at the old Lightsworn cards and correctly identified the fact the main issue with the deck is that milling at the end of the turn gimmick was just too slow, so they gave them a new milling condition. However, the Twilightsworn milling condition isn't actually all that helpful, because it requires you to have another Lightsworn monster on field already to activate the effect before you can get any value. This really doesn't help a big problem the Lightsworns had at this time, which is that they didn't have much swarming potential in the first turn in the archetype. The deck relies on Wolf and Duelist to swarm the board, which requires getting pretty lucky with your mills off of Charge of the Light Brigade and Solar Recharge, which Duelist couldn't even proc her effect off anyway, so you only really had Wolf. The deck didn't have any ways to foolish burial their own monsters until later support after even the Twilightsworns, so their swarming ability is pretty iffy, at least on turn 1. Once they did get their milling going, they can summon a ton of monsters, but that usually required waiting until the end phase. The Twilightsworns would have fixed this issue if they milled you on their own, without another monster, but that's not how the cards work. Not to mention that this alone isn't actually what the deck needed. If the ability to mill a few cards with their normal summon would have saved the archetype, then Raiden would have made the deck meta when it first came out. The deck really just needed a bold, new direction that allowed it to have some easier swarming ability, either by sending their wolves to the grave more easily, or by having cards that let them special summon themselves from the hand on their own accord. The Twilightsworn mill effect was a step in the right direction, but the Lightsworn archetype really needed a leap in the right direction at this point. The issue compounds onto the whole banishing card sub-theme, as not having easy access to fast milling makes having a graveyard full of cards you can easily banish for their effects more difficult, which makes the Twilightsworn overall less powerful than you'd like. On your first turn, you'll sometimes be forced to banish a Lightsworn from your hand to use their effects, which is bad enough that at that point, you probably just wouldn't activate the effect at all. There's also the fact that banishing cards from your graveyard makes summoning Judgment Dragon more difficult, which is really annoying as even in 2017, wiping the entire board multiple times a turn was a powerful effect. Of course, if you wanted to use Punishment Dragon, you would need to banish cards aggressively, which meant that in deck building, you kind of had to choose between summoning either Judgment or Punishment Dragon consistently. This is just completely unnecessary as an issue that could have been solved by having Punishment Dragon summoning condition check both the graveyard and banishment, or better yet, by not adding in a completely unnecessary banishing gimmick to a deck about the graveyard. Now that we've covered the issues with the support so far, we can keep an eye out for how the spell and trap card support helps alleviate these problems. Starting off with Twilight Twin Dragons. This is a normal spell card with the effect where, if you control a Punishment Dragon, you can target one Judgment Dragon in your graveyard and return it to your hand, then mill 4 cards. Whenever it's milled, if you control a Judgment Dragon, you can target a Punishment Dragon in your graveyard and return it to your hand, then banish the top 4 cards of your deck. This is the definition of a win more card. For a deck that mostly needed a buff to its pace of play rather than the power of its effect, giving them a card that only does anything once they have one of their 2 boss monsters on field is kind of silly. Next is Twilight Cloth. This is a normal trap of the effect where you target a Lightsworn you control, then banish any number of Lightsworn monsters from your graveyard and give it 200 attack and defense for each card banished this way. It also has the effect where, when it's milled by a Lightsworn monster's effect for the rest of this turn, your Lightsworn monsters can't be destroyed by battle or card effects. This is a card that honestly could have been released with the first wave of Lightsworns, and at that point, it may have had a chance. The rate here is just not good enough to even use this in a gimmicky OTK strategy, and battle traps were pretty outdated by code of the Duelist. The mill effect isn't good enough to justify playing what's generally a brick in your deck. Next is Twilight Eraser. This is a normal trap with the effect where, if you control 2 Lightsworn monsters with the same type but different names, you banish 2 Lightsworn monsters from your graveyard, and then target 2 cards in the field and banish them. It also lets you special summon a Lightsworn monster from your hand if it's milled by a Lightsworn monster's effect. This is a card that's very flavorful, but kinda bad. All of the Lightsworns and Twilightsworn monsters share the type of their other versions. So this card is active when you had the new and old version of the card on the field, which is very cool. Unfortunately, that doesn't make it practical. Having 2 monsters with the same type in Lightsworns is pretty hard since most of the cards have different types from each other. There are also some cards with overlap, but not enough to make getting this effect off anything approaching consistent. That's a real shame because its hand effect is actually pretty useful. You aren't always going to have a Lightsworn you want to have in hand whenever it gets milled, but it happens often enough that you usually won't be upset to mill this card. It would maybe see play despite how niche the actual effect of the card is, if it's summoned from the deck or graveyard as well, or maybe if it triggered off of being milled by any card so you could send it with Foolish Burial Goods. But as it is right now, the second effect isn't good enough to justify playing a brick. And finally, we have March of the Dark Brigade. This is a normal spell that lets you take 1 Lightsworn monster that has a level in your graveyard and add it to your hand. Then banish cards from the top of your deck equal to its level, and it's a hard once per turn. This is maybe the card that gets the most shafted by this shift into banishing on the Twilightsworn's effects instead of milling. If this just made you mill cards, it would be an absolute staple in the deck, one of the best support cards they could have asked for. Instead, this card is just kind of bad. It is nice to return a Lightsworn from your grave to hand since you mill so much, but banishing cards to the top of your deck doesn't do anything for this deck, outside of letting you get Punishment Dragon out more often. And since you're probably not playing that card, as summoning it is so inconsistent even with this support, this effect is basically just a downside. It helps your Lumina a bit, but it's not that much value. So this is just a warrior returning alive with a tiny bit of an upside, which isn't a good enough card to have seen consistent play over the years, and is just mostly okay in this deck. March of the Dark Brigade isn't an awful card, but it's such a disappointment considering what it could have been, especially the card it's based off being one of the best cards in the archetype. That sentiment applies to the Twilight Swords in general, really. While they have a cool theme and promised a new spin on a classic, beloved archetype, they instead release and didn't really change anything for the deck. The thing is, making a support wave for Twilightsworn that banishes from the graveyard as a cost is actually a pretty good idea. It works well with all the milling the archetype gets, and it does add a new dimension to their gameplay. The issue is that these cards were, overall, too weak. Punishment Dragon could have been a good boss monster for the deck if it were just easier to summon. Raikou and Lila could have been good removal if they didn't take up your entire normal summon. And Lumina is fine extension, if only the deck was better at actually banishing its own monsters quickly. If the monsters had a slightly better mill condition, a few of them had a way to summon themselves out for free, and maybe some slightly better effects, then the cards could have been a good expansion of the Lightsworn archetype. But the cards themselves were too few in number and too low in power to make a meaningful impact on how the deck was played, let alone the wider metagame. Of course, considering how popular Lightsworns were, they did get more support after Twilightsworn, and by all accounts, these cards were far more successful. It may be helpful to see how Twilightsworns could have worked by looking at what future Lightsworn support did better. Not too long after the Twilightsworn support, the deck got Curious the Lightsworn Dominion, though saying this was a Lightsworn card specifically isn't quite accurate. This is a Link 3 monster with 2400 attack that requires 3 monsters with the same attribute but different types. It has the effects where, if it's destroyed by battle or leaves the field due to an opponent's card effect, you can return a card from the graveyard to your hand. It has 2 effects on hard once per turns. When it's Link summoned, you can send any card from your deck to the grave, and if a card is sent from your deck to the grave, you mill 3. This card ended up being a bit of a problem, because it doesn't actually require you to play any Lightsworn cards to summon it, and Foolish Barreling any card in a Link 3 is just really good. The other 2 effects are also quite strong, and the card was obviously amazing for Lightsworns. But having a card so good it gets banned because of what other decks did with it isn't exactly what you want for your archetype. After Curious, it took a little while before we got any more real Lightsworn support, but in Legacy of Destruction, the deck got 5 more support cards, and they're all pretty great. Whis, Lightsworn Archfiend, Lightsworn Dragonling, Minerva, the Athenian Lightsworn, Enlightenment Dragon, and Lightsworn Aegis are the amazing support cards that Lightsworn fans have been waiting years for. Starting with the main deck cards, Lightsworn Dragonling is a level 4 dragon that has 3 effects, all on hard once per turns. If you have a Lightsworn monster in grave, you can special summon it from your hand. When it's special summoned, it sends any Lightsworn from deck to grave except itself. And when it's sent to the grave, you can add a dragon monster with exactly 3000 attack and 2600 defense from your deck to your hand, which describes both Judgment Dragon and Punishment Dragon. Lightsworn Dragonling is the circular for the deck. Does literally everything you could ask for. As soon as you mill a single Lightsworn, which isn't hard in this deck, it becomes a combo starter that instantly allows you to make a rank 4 like Minerva to make even more plays. This does mean you won't get to search for one of your big dragons, but you don't really want those until later in the game, or until your combo anyway. And there's more than enough ways to work around this with generic links. Whis is an equally insane starter for the deck. This is a level 4 Fiend Tuner with 2 effects, each on a hard once per turn. While it's in your hand, you can place a Lightsworn monster from your hand on top of your deck to special summon it, then mill 2 cards. Also, if it's sent from deck to grave, you can target a Lightsworn monster in your graveyard and special summon it. This card is also really nice for Lightsworns. One of the most annoying things about the deck is getting a Wolf or Felis stuck in your hand, where they literally don't do anything. Whis is a card that's good enough to play that also naturally turns these hard bricks into soft bricks, which makes playing the deck a lot more user-friendly. You also finally have a card to fetch whatever Lightsworn you want out of your bin with Foolish Burial, which is also nice. There's also the normal trap card, Lightsworn Aegis. This card has 2 effects, each on a hard once per turn. If it's milled, you can set it to your field. And when it's activated, you can target face-up cards equal to the number of Lightsworn monsters you control, and negate their effects until the end of the turn. Aegis is great interruption for the deck. It's best when you mill it, of course, but its condition is easy enough to work around that it's usually able to at least negate a couple of cards. Aegis isn't a card you play too many copies of, but it increases the power of the deck by a lot by simply existing. Next is Minerva, the Athenian Lightsworn. This is a level 8 synchro monster with 2800 attack and 1800 defense. It has fully generic materials and 3 effects, all of which are hard once per turns. It passively makes it so that your Lightsworn monsters can't be banished by card effects. When it's synchro summoned, you can send Lightsworn monsters from your deck to the grave, up to the number of Lightsworn monsters uses synchro materials, and then banish up to 4 Lightsworn monsters from your graveyard to mill that many cards. Minerva is a great extender for the deck. Between Weiss and Felis, who are level 4 tuners, and since all of your best monsters are level 4, making a level 8 synchro is very easy. In fact, a single successful Lightsworn Dragonling can send a Felis to grave, which will special summon herself and allow you to go right into Minerva, while also triggering Dragonling to add a Judgment Dragon from deck to hand. Minerva really pushes the combo potential of the deck to new heights, making it a far more explosive archetype than it had ever been before. The final support card the deck received was Enlightenment Dragon. This is a level 10 fusion with 3000 attack and defense. It can be fused with Judgment and Punishment Dragon. However, it can also be summoned by banishing a Judgment and Punishment Dragon from your field and graveyard, one from each. Once per turn, as a quick effect, you can pay 2000 life points to banish all other cards from the field and graveyard. During the end of the turn, you mill 4 cards. Also, if this card is destroyed by an opponent's card, you can add a Judgment Dragon and Punishment Dragon you have banished to your hand, then special summon both of them, ignoring their summoning conditions. This is a fine boss monster for the deck. It does require playing both of the dragons, which are a bit outdated by today's standards, but at the very least it does give you a better summoning condition to bring itself out. This is the least exciting of the cards the deck got, but it's not bad by any means. Now that we've seen the new Lightsworn support, we can compare it to the Twilightsworns and see why it's so much better. Now obviously these cards came out 5 years apart, so it's not fair to directly compare their power levels, but we can notice a few trends. For one, the new Lightsworn support focuses mostly on giving the deck new cards that enable the deck's best cards and giving them more meaningful interaction. Cards like Lightsworn Dragonling are designed around enabling Felis and Wolf, the most powerful cards in Lightsworn. And Lightsworn Aegis is great as a form of interruption. The Twilightsworns falter by comparison. While they did give the deck more meaningful interruption with cards like Feco, Twilightsworn Fighter, it came at the expense of what the deck was good at beforehand, rather than trying to enable it. Punishment Dragon is the best example of this. Rather than being a straightforward upgrade to the original deck's boss monster, this is a side grade that requires severely warping normal Lightsworn decks to accommodate playing it. This type of side archetype design isn't necessarily an issue, but the Twilightsworns were, once again, too restrictive and low powered to actually enable this alternative game plan. The deck needed a lot more if it was going to successfully pivot into this new game plan. So the Twilightsworns were an interesting take on a fan favorite archetype that failed to capture its magic. The monsters had okay effects, but were very reliant on your normal summon and didn't really speed up the deck as much as they needed to. The cards fell into the exact same pitfalls as the original Lightsworns in the modern day, and often actually went against the Lightsworns playstyle. Future support did a much better job making Lightsworn stronger, which only further pushed the Twilightsworn out of the limelight. While the playstyle the Twilightsworns were trying to push wasn't inherently flawed, the cards were simply too weak to be effective.